morning. Chapter 1, Day 1, 2025, Nantucket Book Festival. I am so excited for this incredible event, for our incredible lineup, and I could not be more honored to kick off this festival with Dawn Tripp. Dawn is the nationally best-selling author of 5 novels. Her most recent book, Jackie, was long-listed for the Massachusetts Book Award and won the San Diego Writers Festival Historical Fiction Award. Her novel, Georgia, was the finalist for the New England Book Award and winner of the Mary Lynn Kotz Award for Art in Literature. Dawn is also the author of Game of Secrets, Moontide, and The Season of Open Water, which won the Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction. Her poems and essays have appeared in the Virginia Quarterly, Harvard Review, Conjunctions, NPR, and many others. Dawn, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara. I'm honored to be here. This is a really special community. I have felt it in the weeks leading up to this festival. This is a really special festival, and I just want to say thank you to everyone who is a part of it, and to all of you for being here. To you, Sara, with your co-chair Mary, Tim, for your incredible leadership of the Nantucket Book Foundation. Kaylee, where are you, Kaylee? You are absolutely extraordinary. And the literary committee, and also the board. And I just want to, if you just give me 1 second, I just want to read something. I need my glasses. These days, meaning the next 4 days, are filled with the majesty of story, the wonder of worlds explored through the minds and imaginations of the writers and the pages of their books. In a world divided, the power of words to shape our lives feels that much more profound. I really believe in that. I believe in that when I write. That is why I write. You know, I write in order to kind of connect with a reader. We write alone, we read alone, and a book is that intimate place where a reader and a writer connect. And the experience, the magic of this weekend is something that I'm just so grateful to be a part of and to have the chance to be here with all of you to kick off today. So thank you.
And Dawn, those wonderful poetic words were written by my co-chair, Mary Haft. And I read it and I got goosebumps. And she took the lead on that, and it was so perfect and so profound. Okay, Dawn Tripp, let's get down into it. So I want to know, first of all, everybody here is going to buy the book. Okay, get that in your brains right now, because this book is so beautiful and so brilliant and so deeply moving. As I read and reread it, I often would pause and soak in the words. I want you all to have that experience. Also, Father's Day's coming up, your mother's birthday, your mother-in-law, your sister, your day. So everybody here's buying books. I want to give you, you're going to read it on your own time. I want to give you what you can't get on the page. I want to give you the story behind the story, the secret stuff. So Dawn Tripp, tell us about the secret stuff. Tell us about your 10-year, decade-long research process into this extraordinary woman, the iconic Jackie Kennedy Onassis.
So I actually came to Jackie first 16 years ago, so long before I started the book. My first, the sort of the seed, the spark of this book came when I was at an independent bookstore with my 2 boys. They were 8 and 3. Now they're 24 and 19. And we love books as a family. I grew up surrounded by books. I grew up surrounded by stories. I always have felt that, you know, a book, all you have to do is pull a book off the shelf in a library, off the shelf in your home, off the shelf in an independent store, and you open it, and there's a world that you can fall into. There is an entirely new adventure, an entirely new experience that you have the chance to learn and explore. And so I wanted my boys to grow up, my two sons to grow up with that same kind of experiential understanding of the power of words and the power of stories. And so we used to go to our local independent, we used to go on actually field trips to other independents. We used to go to the library. You know, you all know the magic of having that one little card, and you hand over the card and then you're allowed to take out, you know, a stack of 10 books. So I brought my boys to our local independent bookstore one day, and my older son pulled a book off the shelf. It's a little book. It's called The Best Love Poems of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. I don't know if any of you seen that book? It's a really lovely little book. And the poems in that book had been selected, curated, and with an introduction that was written by her daughter, Caroline. And my son Jack kind of walked up to me and said, "Mom, this," and there was a picture of a mother and a child reading on the cover, which is maybe why he was drawn to it. I'm not sure, but he said, "Can we bring this home tonight?" And I looked at it and I was suddenly curious. I suddenly wanted to know I knew Jackie had a really extraordinary 2-decade career as a book editor, but I'd never really considered who she was as a reader. And I was suddenly curious to know, how did Caroline consider her mother as a reader? How did Caroline, like the fact that Caroline had chosen to kind of curate this volume and write an introduction about her mother's love of poetry, that was really interesting to me and unexpected. So we brought that book home, and that night I did something I didn't usually do when they were 8 and 3. I read aloud from the introduction, but again, I was really curious. It's only a 3 to 4 page introduction. And that introduction, though, for me was revelatory, because in that introduction, Caroline talked about how her mother read constantly. Jackie was a voracious reader. Jackie had grown up loving poetry, writing poetry, reading poetry. She loved poems of adventure. She loved poems like childhood poems, like kind of poems of play. She loved poems of reflection. She loved poems that kind of, reflected her romantic spirit. She loved poems about the spirit of America. And that was again so interesting that this was how Caroline was choosing to describe her mother. And at the end of that little introduction, Caroline talked a great deal, she wrote a great deal about how her parents had really come together over a shared love of books and a shared passion for the power of stories. And at the end of that introduction, Caroline reflected on how, from her mother, she herself and her brother John had inherited a faith in the power of ideas and the words we use to express them as the greatest power that we have. And I read that sentence, and I suddenly asked myself the question, who was she? Who was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis underneath the woman we think we see? And for me, a book always begins with that kind of spark, and it usually is sustained by a driving question. And for me, that question, who was Jackie underneath the woman we think we see, this work is really an interrogation of that question.
Ooh, interrogation. One of my favorite things. Dawn, this book is, first of all, that was so beautifully and heartfelt. I got goosebumps. All the little hairs on my arms stood up. You come alive with your curiosity and your passion for her.
Curiosity is everything. And I feel like the older I get, the more I realize curiosity, wonder, intention, those are really the dimensions of, and integrity, always. Those are the dimensions of character that I believe in. Those are the kind of dimensions of who I aspire to be that I hope, shape the decisions that I make.
Yes, curiosity, wonder, intention, integrity. What if all of us lived with these ethics? That would be a beautiful world. Dawn, this book is a novel. And people often think that the lines between fiction and nonfiction are ironclad, right? You go into the bookstore, fiction to the left, nonfiction to the right. Biographies over here, novels over here. But you and I have had really interesting conversations about that, and you have shared that you don't think those are so ironclad boundaries after all. I'd like to share that with the audience.
So when you read, who here has read a biography of one person, like maybe 3 to 4 biographies of one person back to back? Yeah.
I raised my hand at 1, but then I said no.
When you read 3 to 4 biographies of one person and you read them back to back, you realize that even though the salient events are the same, each is a portrait. Each is an interpretation, depending on the selection of facts, the elision of facts, how the facts are arranged, and where the writer has chosen to place the emphasis. And that really, that understanding drove home for me when I was researching Georgia. And when I first started researching my novel on Georgia O'Keeffe, I read 3 to 4 back-to-back biographies of Georgia O'Keeffe, and it was like 3 different women had been described. And I was suddenly so curious about that, that sort of range of interpretation, and how we sometimes imagine that nonfiction is true and fiction is made up. But I really believe that nonfiction also, depending on the rigor of the biographer or the writer, can also be an interpretation. And I believe that fiction, when it's written in a way that is committed to the scholarship and committed to being a contribution to the scholarship, that fiction can add to our understanding. It can offer another way in to our understanding of a person or an era or a life. And in both Jackie and Georgia, the subject of the theme that underpins both of those novels is they're both explorations of a woman and her relationship to power, and women that we think we know, and women that we have very clear and sometimes very stylized views of. Jackie was a complex and fascinating and brilliant woman. She spoke multiple languages, she read constantly, she was often the smartest person in the room, and one of the things that I really loved about Jack Kennedy is that he came to recognize that and acknowledge it. She was strategic, she was intentional, she played with her public image in a way that allowed her to kind of go off and kind of scoot underneath all of it and live a life on her own terms. And she was articulate about that. She talked about that. And that's all there in the historical record, but it's not necessarily where we've chosen to place the focus. And so in this book, which was actually written as a biography for 7 years before I kind of transposed it into first person. It was written third person, like heavily footnoted, because I wanted to stay close to the historical record. I wanted to stay close to the facts. And I didn't want to take a lot of liberties with a woman's life that I felt had such integrity and such force and such complexity. And she hadn't really been considered through that lens. And I wondered why. Like, why haven't we considered her through the full, through the lens of the full range of who she was and what she contributed to our America?
Dawn, you have strong roots in and a deep love for poetry, which, as I read Jackie, I felt deeply. And I would often pause and reread a certain paragraph or even a sentence because it was so lyrical and so beautifully rendered. And I just would sort of want to drink the moment of absorbing that prose in. Tell us about poetry and prose and how you weave those together.
Poetry is my first impulse. So I wrote poetry for years before I wrote fiction. I wrote poetry when I was in college. When I was in college, I was actually at Harvard, and I took a poetry workshop with Seamus Heaney. And I only wrote poetry at that time. And he was the person who first said to me, he first pointed out that in all of my poems, which were often very short poems, he's like, they're spring-loaded narratives. Ooh. Like in each of your poems, there's like something that's just happened and something that's just about to happen. And I'd never, and that was just one of those kind of insights. I love how teachers can do this. Do we have teachers in the audience? I adore teachers. I feel like teachers will sometimes say something and you won't necessarily fully accept it in your 19-year-old headstrong, willful self-absorbed self. But it'll roll around in there. And so that became something that when I graduated from school, I worked, but I also started writing a really, really long narrative poem that eventually turned into my first novel. But poetry is always it's my first impulse. It's how I write. So my early drafts are all written longhand, and they're all written in fragments. They're all written in fragments of poetry that I then build out into scenes. All my favorite writers, and one of them is here this weekend, Ocean Vuong is one of my favorite writers, often have that, really strong drive of poetry in their work. And for me, that's a transcendent dimension of why I write and also why I read.
When I was reading along, drinking in Jackie, I got in a certain amount of the book and found an interstitial from JFK's perspective, and there are several in there. Tell us why you made that creative choice and how you felt that it added to creating a fuller perspective of her.
So the sections that are, they're very short, and they're actually not written first person, they're written third person. So I'm not technically, they're in his point of view, but it's not a close, it's not close point of view the way it is with Jackie. But I feel, because I don't feel really equipped, or like I understand him as fully as I came to understand her. But what I was interested in, I was really interested in their relationship. The deeper I got into their relationship, which I had originally assumed was purely transactional, the deeper I got into their relationship, the more I realized what a bond, what a powerful intellectual passion they shared, and the ways that they were sort of drawn together. Right after in the wake of the assassination, again and again, of his assassination, again and again, Jackie was quoted as saying, "Jack and I had just begun to figure everything out." And I was so struck by when I read that, because I suddenly had to kind of go back and discern, well, what was it they had just begun to figure out? And what had been the arc of their relationship if it hadn't been purely transactional? And I felt like those sections from his point of view allowed for a different perspective into her, allowed us to see her from someone who was one step removed and who was very drawn to her. And at one point late in his life, shortly before he died, he turned to a friend of his and remarked, there's only one woman in this world I could have married, and I married her. And the bond between them was really unique. It was very complicated. They were very young. They had an amazing amount of pressure. But they also had this fascinating love story. And Jackie, towards the end of her life, she described him as the love of her life. That was really interesting to me, because he was also maddening to her. And it's not that he always, fully respected her personhood, but he did respect her intellect. And he did respect her willfulness and her feistiness. There was a great, he was once asked by a reporter to describe his wife in one word, and the word he used was fey, F-E-Y, and that's such an unexpected word. It can have negative connotations, but it can also mean fairy-like. It can also mean slightly magical, and someone who can't quite be pinned down. And that was so true to her character. To everyone who knew her, she was always described as someone who was so multifaceted, but who was very, very hard to kind of, pin down.
One of the many things that I learned from reading Jackie and that I was surprised by was how much these two very famous people were, like us, passionate bookworms and passionate readers separately and together, and how books and reading really served as a bond between them. And of course, I then went down the rabbit hole researching them, and I found this picture of them with stacks of books beside themselves, and it was so beautiful. And how she would give him book recommendations, and they would speak about books they were reading. I absolutely love that, and I was wondering what the most surprising thing that you learned about her was.
The most surprising thing with regard to books specifically, or anything?
Yeah.
So just one quick thing about books. It was actually in that portrait that Caroline, for me, the portrait that emerged of Jackie out of that short introduction that Caroline wrote in that introduction to the book of poems. Caroline talked about how her mother used to cut lines from her favorite poems, her favorite writers, her favorite philosophers, and give them to Jack, and he would integrate them into his speeches. Again, she was so intrinsic to so many of the cultural and ideas that became interwoven with his politics. And that was fascinating to me. It was her idea to kind of have him, he wrote a very famous speech about the kind of the relationship between the poet and the politician, between poetry and politics, and the fact that a country will be remembered for its poets, for its artists, and her commitment to art, her commitment to culture, her commitment to the White House was so much about creating it was creating almost a cultural landscape, a cultural stage where his young administration, which had really fumbled in the early months, where he could emerge into power. And she was a partner in that, in that vision. And that, she was the person who, in the wake of his assassination, which she had, we forget sometimes, we know that was a national tragedy. We know it was an American tragedy. We forget sometimes what a personal trauma it was. And she was right there. And then she was the person who, over the next 3 to 4 days, stewarded the country. She was the person who sent a call back to the White House and said, pull the book on Lincoln's funeral off the shelves at the White House Library, and we want to model Jack's funeral exactly after Lincoln's, because she understood it wasn't performative. It was because she believed in the America that he and she had been a part of envisioning. And I love that she was so intentional, that she had that presence of mind, even in the wake of that horrific and devastating event. But one of the most exciting things that I discovered about her had nothing to do with books. It had nothing to do with the fact that she actually was the first, as an editor, she was the first person to publish the Egyptian writer who'd won the Nobel, Naguib Mahfouz, into English. One of the things, though, that I loved the most about her was that she used to love to water ski. And she was a formidable water skier. And we know she was a really incredible equestrian. We know that we don't always think of her, though, as an athlete. And she was such a good water skier. And if you see, there were videos, it was on the news, actually, in 1962. And we forget this, too. Like, these are not the dimensions of Jackie that we share. But there's a video of her slalom skiing on the news in 1962. And she's slalom skiing off the wake, of a motorboat. And then it actually has an inboard, which for those of you who know boats, that's not always the easiest thing to slalom off the, because it's a slow start. But then there's a second cut in that same video where she's slalom skiing off one boat, and then alongside her in tandem slalom skiing is astronaut John Glenn, which I love. And again, on the news in 1962, national news. And you can find it if you search it. But then there's a third cut of that same video, because when I saw that video, I went and I found it at the JFK Library Archives, which has everything. The JFK Library Archives in Boston is a treasure, and it has drafts of seating charts, which actually can be quite helpful when you're creating a story. But in the third cut of that video, which was not on the news, this third cut, Jackie's water skiing. She's alone again without John Glenn. And while she's water skiing, she's holding her daughter, Caroline. And Caroline's 4. And I love that. And I didn't put that's not in the book, but it told me so much about her character. Because what does that tell you about a mother who will take her daughter water skiing, holding her in her arms? Caroline's not on skis. Jackie's just holding her. It means she has incredible core strength. She's bold, very bold. She has an incredible sense of her own power. And she also wants to introduce her daughter to an experience that she loves. And that dimension of Jackie's character, her care and commitment as a mother, and how her passion for her children really determined, after Caroline was born, almost every single choice that she made, that was revelatory to me. And that was not something, and I found it again and again and again.
But Dawn, that also says so much about you as a writer, because someone else might find this clip of her water skiing and think, oh my gosh, that's so cute, or that's so funny, or wow, I didn't know this. Anyway, next video. But because of your curiosity and your sense of wonder and your care and integrity, you paused and thought, wait, what does this mean? It's not just a clip of a famous woman water skiing.
Well, I think when you decide to, when you look at a woman like Jackie Kennedy, and you realize how much integrity she had, and how, I wanted to create a portrait that was based on the things that mattered to her. And it was a little shocking to me that of all that's been written about her, there wasn't really, I couldn't find one biography. There is one of O'Keeffe that I love and highly recommend, but there wasn't one biography of Jackie that really captured, that really was sort of focused on her life in a way that the entire focus was on the things that gave her life integrity and purpose and meaning. And that was really surprising to me. There are actually 2 incredible biographies that are written about her love of books. And I love those. And those are beautiful. Clint Hill's writings on Jackie, I think, are extraordinary. But I wasn't able to find a biography that that didn't get kind of all, mired down the rabbit holes of looking at her through the lens of her husband's affairs. And that really wasn't, that's not what drove her life. It was a dimension of her life. It was something she had to deal with. It was something she had to contend with and overcome and discern and figure out. but it didn't define who she was and who she went on to be. And that's what was interesting to me. And so when you say I had integrity, it wasn't so much that I did, it was that I wanted to create a portrait of this woman who's been so widely seen, but hasn't always been seen through the lens of the things that she believed in.
And what a loving act of service to give her that after all these years.
Well, you also, it's not, I mean, her and also young women. You sort of think sometimes young women, young men, young people imagine that the history's back there somewhere. But history is constantly acting on our now. And history is constantly, there are currents of history that are constantly interfacing with our present in order to shape our future.
So, Dawn, as a magical creature yourself, tell us about your relationship to creativity. Do you write every day? What do you do when the words won't come? How does it feel to you? What is your experience of writing?
So I write every day in my head, whether I write every day in my notebook. I'm always living in the world of a story, so when I finish a book, I always know what I'm doing next. Writer's block isn't something, I feel like I should always knock on wood when I say this. Writer's block isn't something I've kind of encountered. There are always days when the words are not as easy. And then I read, I do yoga, I go for a run, I jump in the ocean when it's warm. I go out for a walk. And I sort of put myself back in the world. And if things get really, if I find that if the writing gets stuck, it's usually because I may be going down the wrong path. And I've learned how to trust my intuition that way. I've been publishing for 25 years. Jackie's my fifth book, my fifth published book. I have 2 books that are under the bed. We all have those. And Alice, I see you laughing in the front. We all have books. I'm not I feel like I'm not a particularly prolific writer in the sense that I don't necessarily generate a book a year. But a book takes the time that it takes. Jackie took 10 years. It took that time for me to get the book to the point where I felt like, okay, this is the right book. Like, this is a book that I feel proud of. This is a book that's done what I set out to do. I feel like, other books are short, are less time. But it's a very, in terms of creativity, I'm also a Quaker. And I really believe in trusting that kind of, that inner voice, that inner light, and trusting that there's a way forward.
I love
It's
that.
a very vague reaction to creativity. Longhand is everything to me. I will say that. Everything I do first, I do longhand. I have notebooks, and I'm very particular about my notebooks. I have one in the back.
Oh, in terms of the brand, the feel of the paper?
The paper, the brand, the pens. When I'm feeling a little stuck, I always write diagonally on a page. I never write in straight lines because the lines just feel too, like I just need to kind of get outside the lines a little bit.
I'm going to remember that when I'm driving later. So can you tell us what brand this magical notebook is?
Paper Republic.
And do you have a special kind of pen?
I use a range of pens, but it does matter how they feel on the page.
Okay, good. All right, I'm remembering
And
this.
I only use Palomino Blackwing pencils. Anyone know Palomino Blackwing pencils? Yeah, they're pretty great.
They're the best. Okay, so it is the worst when the moderator is sitting on stage and you're like, shut your cake hole, lady. I got questions. So I will shut my cake hole now because I know you do have questions and I want you to have access to Dawn because that's the magic of this book festival is connecting to authors. So with that, I would like to open the floor to questions. Okay, we have one right over here and then over to Marcy. Okay, we're coming for you. And right over here in the green and, yes, thank you.
Dawn, you said that you started this book as a straight biography with footnotes and, research, etc. What was the impetus for changing it to fiction, and was that a difficult decision to make?
Ooh.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I didn't know if it was going to be fiction or biography, but I became increasingly clear the more I realized the more I felt how much Jackie had been maybe misrepresented or not fully represented, the more I felt the burden of staying to the historical record. So the more I wanted to sort of know in my own head that I could sort of track and trace everything in here back to some source in the historical record. So it was about 7 years in, and I actually the book was written in the third person, so it was written, like a biography, and a little looser than a biography in the sense that it had a more narrative voice. But it was all third person, and I sent it to my editor. I knew something wasn't working. I didn't know what wasn't working, but I don't have a lot of rules for writing. I don't really believe that there are rules for writing. I believe that every writer kind of finds their own way, and the rules change for me, the parameters change book to book, depending on the needs of the story and the needs of, just sort of where I am in my life. But I do believe in one adage that Margaret Atwood once wrote in her book, Negotiating with the Dead, which is a book on writing, and it's fantastic. She said, there's only one question to be asked of any piece of writing. Is it alive or dead? Ooh. And I actually believe in that. And I knew that the book I had written was good, at 7 years in, but I knew it was not quite alive on the page. And I sent it to my editor, a little anxious about that. She's been my editor for 25 years. She actually worked with Jackie at Doubleday, which was kind of incredible. And I said to her, I said, Kate, I feel like it's close, but it's not. I'm a little worried about this because it's not quite doing what I know it needs to do. It's not quite breathing. And she called me I was hoping I was going to get one of the Kate Medina 9-page memos back, but I didn't. I got a phone call, and she said, I think this is actually really close. She said, but I feel like this book wants to be written in the first person. And I said, I don't want to write the book in the first person. And she said, no, I knew that that's what you would say. And she said, that's not what I said. I said, I think the book wants to be written in the first person. And I said, well, I'm going to have to think about that. And she said, well, you do just that. You think about that. So I sat with that for a while. I tried to find my way in. I couldn't. I just couldn't find my way in. And I had a 550-page manuscript, and it was I felt good about it. I felt like it was researched. I knew, I had everything traced. I felt good about what I had. And then I actually almost gave up on the book. And I felt like I couldn't find my way in. I couldn't find my way into the voice of the story. And voice, I believe, is everything. Voice is the magic. In the book I'm working on now, I actually had the voice very early. But with Jackie, the voice didn't come till years and years in. So, and I knew I didn't have the voice. And I put away all the books, except for that one manuscript that I had written. And I put away all the research, all the articles, all the seating charts at the JFK Library, all those, those written texts, all my notes. And I just started spending time with photographs. And because I was suddenly realizing that what I was missing was that kind of life, those kind of in-between moments of a life. And so I started spending time with candid photographs. And I had to dig for them because they're not all in the public domain. But the photographs where Jack and Jackie were together, where they might not have known the camera was on them, photographs, like this, which was taken in June 1957. It's not a well-known image, but to me it was striking. And I was suddenly really curious, like, who were they? Who were these two young people? June 1957, it was before he was, elected president. It's before they were myth. They were just two young people in a marriage, 4 years old, a complicated marriage already. They'd already lost a baby. She was pregnant by then with Caroline. But I suddenly found myself asking those kind of early burning questions that had driven me to her story in the first place. Like, what did she want? What did she believe in? What had just happened between them in that moment? And I printed out that photograph, this photograph, and I started writing into it. And the sections I wrote from Jackie's point of view were in the first person. And I wrote the book again. Like, I sat down and I had my 550-page manuscript, but I rewrote it. Because you can't just go back in and change, like, the she to an I. Like, you have to go in, you're really, you really have to inhabit that space. But I had all the information, I had all the facts. I just needed that, that kind of bright light of the voice. It didn't take so long. It sounds arduous. But, once you, and I think other writers in the audience know this, like, once you find the voice, once the voice is there, you can just go. You fly.
Oh my gosh, what a beautiful note to end on. So we're gonna segue now out to the signing portion of the event, and Dawn will sign and personalize books. And fun fact, you can make her say anything. I always make the author say something completely scandalous so that when I die someday, people will read my collection of inscriptions.
They can make you say anything.
Yeah, and then they'll be like, my God, this woman lived, yeah. Also, Dawn's paperback came out the day before yesterday, and to celebrate, I ordered these custom Jackie cookies. So everyone get a cookie. I'm an Italian woman, I must feed everyone. Everyone get a Jackie cookie and get your signed copy of Jackie from the luminous and brilliant Dawn Tripp.
Thank you.